Ethan adjusted his tie, glancing at his reflection in the chrome panel of the space station's conference room. His usual human self-deprecation was in full swing. Diplomat to the stars? More like comic relief in a galaxy-sized sitcom. The room was a mix of interstellar grandeur and practical alien functionality. Chandeliers that emitted a soft, humming glow floated mid-air. Tables stretched impossibly long to accommodate delegates of varying shapes and sizes. At one end of the room, an alien ambassador with tentacles was attempting to eat what looked like a still-wriggling creature. Ethan sidled up to the human delegation's table, a little too aware of their comparative smallness in the room. The towering Zincarians entered next, and all conversation came to a halt. Tralla, standing at least 8 feet tall, strode in first, a vision of muscular power and calculated precision. Her sharp armor gleamed under the floating lights. With one swift motion, she lifted a 400-pound alien dignitary and moved him aside to clear her path, earning a mix of applause and fearful murmurs. "Humans," she remarked, stopping by their table, her voice deep and resonant, "are these the fragile beings we're supposed to negotiate with? I've stepped on sturdier insects." Ethan couldn't resist. "Well, to be fair, we also make excellent snacks if you're into fried foods. Low cholesterol, too." Her golden eyes narrowed at him. Was that irritation or amusement? Hard to tell. "And you are?" He extended a hand, instantly regretting it as her massive palm engulfed his in a bone-crushing grip. "Ethan. Diplomat, translator, an occasional stand-up comedian, apparently." "You're certainly small," she mused, her gaze lingering, as if assessing whether he could survive a gust of wind. The conversation moved forward, though Ethan couldn't help but notice Tralla occasionally glancing his way, her tail flicking with increasing frequency. Hours later, during the gala, Ethan found himself seated next to Tralla at the dinner table. The spread included a variety of alien delicacies, most of which he decided to avoid. "So, is there anything here that doesn't bite back?" he asked, gesturing at the array of pulsating dishes. Tralla tilted her head. "Humans have such fragile palates. You fear challenge even in food." Ethan smirked. "Not fear, just practicality. You don't want your diplomats passing out from spicy space soup." An elder Zincarian arrived, carrying what he called celebration nectar, a shimmering liquid in crystalline goblets. "A toast to new alliances," he declared. Ethan raised his glass, though the scent of the drink hinted at something potent. "Here's to interstellar peace. And hopefully not blacking out after this." The nectar was deceptively smooth, with a warmth that spread quickly through his chest. A second sip, and his inhibitions began to blur. By the third, Tralla's tail flicks seemed oddly fascinating. "I think your tail's flirting with me," Ethan muttered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Tralla turned, her golden eyes glinting. "Perhaps it is. Or perhaps it's assessing your survivability." "You really know how to sweet-talk a guy," Ethan shot back, grinning despite himself. The night spiraled into a haze of laughter, misunderstandings, and increasingly bold commentary. Tralla challenged Ethan to a strength contest involving arm wrestling. She won handily, while he retaliated with a joke-off that left her struggling to stifle a laugh. By the time the celebration nectar ran out, Ethan found himself leaning on Tralla for balance, her towering frame steady as a pillar. "You know," he slurred, "you're not so bad, for a scary alien warrior." "And you're surprisingly tolerable, for a fragile human," she replied, her voice softer than before. The next morning, Ethan woke up in an unfamiliar suite, his head pounding and his shirt nowhere to be found. Tralla was seated nearby, her usual armor replaced with something more casual but no less intimidating. "Morning," Ethan croaked, rubbing his temples. "Did I die? Because this feels like an alien hangover purgatory." Tralla turned, raising an eyebrow. "If you were dead, you'd be quieter." As fragments of the night began piecing themselves together, Ethan's face paled. "Wait, what happened last night?" Tralla's tail flicked lazily. "Let's just say, you've proven sturdier than expected." Ethan stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You're joking, right? Please tell me this is one of those weird alien pranks. Trala's smirk was the only answer he needed. Ethan sat in the sterile white chamber, flanked by two towering Zinkarian warriors who regarded him with a mix of suspicion and amusement. The room felt more like a courtroom than a medical facility, and the stoic Zinkarian council seated before him wasn't helping. You're telling me, Ethan started, his voice rising with disbelief, that I managed to do what's considered biologically impossible? This isn't just a weird dream I'm having? Trala, standing beside him, crossed her arms and gave him a sideways glance. It seems your species is more resilient than I gave credit for. The elder Zinkarian leaned forward, his golden eyes gleaming with something that might have been approval. This is not a mere accident. This child is a gift of unity, a bridge between our species. A miracle. Ethan laughed nervously. Miracle, sure. But no one's asking how I feel about being the poster child for intergalactic hybrid babies. The council members ignored his quip. The elder continued, you will accompany Trala to Zinkaris. The child must be raised as a symbol of peace. It is your duty. My duty? Ethan's voice cracked. I'm a diplomat, not a parent. I don't even keep houseplants alive, and now you want me to co-parent with someone who could bench press a star cruiser? Trala's tail flicked, a gesture Ethan was learning to recognize as irritation. You will adapt. Zinkarians do not shirk responsibility. He threw his hands up. Of course not, because you're all built like action figures. Meanwhile, I'm over here trying not to get stepped on. Despite his protests, the decision was final. Within hours, Ethan found himself aboard a Zinkarian ship headed to their homeworld. The transition was less than smooth. Trala was assigned quarters adjacent to his, and she wasted no time implementing her version of protection. The door between their rooms stayed perpetually open, allowing her to keep an eye on him. Is this necessary? Ethan asked, watching as Trala inspected his sleeping quarters for potential hazards. Humans are fragile. I will ensure your safety, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ethan rolled his eyes. I've managed 30+ years without alien supervision, thanks. Later that night, as he attempted to sleep, Trala's voice boomed through the adjoining wall. You must rest adequately. The child's development depends on your health. Ethan groaned. You're literally policing my bedtime now? This isn't parenting, it's babysitting. The absurdity didn't stop there. Zinkarian culture was built around strength and resilience, and their pregnancy customs reflected that. Trala's protective instincts kicked into overdrive, leading to a series of escalating mishaps. During a meal in the communal dining hall, she intercepted a utensil Ethan dropped, snatching it mid-air before it could hit the ground. Your reflexes are slow, she noted, handing it back to him. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Captain Obvious, he muttered under his breath. On another occasion, Trala physically lifted Ethan to carry him over a puddle of what she deemed potentially hazardous alien fluids. You do realize I'm not actually made of glass, right? Ethan said, dangling helplessly in her grip. It is better to err on the side of caution, she replied. Her overprotectiveness extended beyond physical safety. During a council meeting, a warrior suggested testing Ethan's endurance to determine his fitness for co-parenting. Testing? Ethan repeated. What does that even mean? The warrior smirked. We must know if you can withstand the pressures of Zinkarian life. Ethan glanced at Trala, who looked unbothered. Let me guess, he said, this involves some kind of gladiator-style fight to the death? Not death, the warrior corrected, but combat, yes. Ethan stood and addressed the room. Listen, I may not have giant muscles or a tail, but I've got something you all underestimate, wit. And you'd be amazed what a human can accomplish when the stakes are this high. His unexpected confidence caught the room's attention. When the warriors finally agreed to a less combative test, a series of mental and strategic challenges, Ethan managed to outwit several of them, earning grudging respect. As the days passed, he began to notice subtle changes in Trala. Her once dismissive remarks about human fragility softened, replaced by genuine curiosity. "You are unlike others of your kind," she admitted one evening as they shared a rare moment of calm. "Flattery won't get you out of being overbearing," Ethan teased. Her tail flicked, but this time, the gesture seemed almost playful. "Perhaps there's more to humans than I thought. Maybe there's more to Zincarians than scary muscles and terrifying bedtime enforcement," Ethan replied, grinning. Tralla didn't smile, but her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, Ethan began to feel like this partnership, however strange and unexpected, might not be entirely impossible. Ethan sat at a massive Zincarian table, staring at what could only be described as an alien parenting manual. It was as thick as a cinder block, covered in indecipherable glyphs, and smelled faintly of metal. Across from him, Tralla looked entirely at ease, sipping a glowing blue beverage that Ethan could only assume was some form of alien prenatal tonic. "This is the guide?" Ethan asked, flipping through pages of diagrams featuring things with tails and claws, none of which resembled a human baby. Tralla nodded. "It is the foundation of all Zincarian parenting wisdom." Ethan held up a page that seemed to suggest training newborns by having them dodge projectiles. "And this? It strengthens their reflexes," Tralla said, as if it were obvious. Ethan set the book down with a thud. "Right. Well, humans tend to stick to simpler methods like lullabies, diaper changes, and not weaponizing infancy." Tralla tilted her head. "Diaper changes?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're going to need a serious cultural exchange program before this kid shows up." The weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations, with Ethan and Tralla clashing over nearly every aspect of parenting. Tralla insisted on building a nursery that doubled as a fortified training ground, complete with padded walls and holographic combat simulations. Ethan countered with demands for soft blankets and stuffed animals, to which Tralla scoffed, "Such items serve no practical purpose." "Comfort is practical," Ethan argued. "Humans thrive on emotional support, not just survival drills." Their disagreements often drew an audience of curious Zincarians, who found Ethan's parenting ideas both baffling and hilarious. One particularly nosy warrior even asked, "Do all human infants require such fragility accommodations?" Ethan smirked. "Only if we want them to grow up without a fear of everything that moves." Despite the constant back and forth, Ethan found himself gradually adjusting to Zincarian life. Their routines were intense, morning combat training, followed by strategic planning sessions, and endless rounds of physical conditioning, but he discovered that his quick wit and resourcefulness often gave him an unexpected edge. During one training exercise, Tralla set up a simulated ambush to test his protective instincts. Instead of panicking, Ethan used a combination of misdirection and sheer audacity to outmaneuver the holographic attackers. When the simulation ended, Tralla raised an eyebrow. "You adapted quickly." "I'm not just a pretty face," Ethan replied, brushing imaginary dust off his shirt. Tralla's tail flicked in what Ethan had come to recognize as approval. "Perhaps there is potential in you after all." Their dynamic shifted subtly after that. Tralla began to involve Ethan in more meaningful discussions about the baby's upbringing, occasionally conceding to his suggestions, though not without a healthy dose of skepticism. When Ethan introduced the concept of storytelling as a way to bond with their future child, Tralla seemed unconvinced. Zincarian offspring learn through action, not idle tales. "Maybe," Ethan countered, "but stories teach values, creativity, and, most importantly, they keep kids entertained without risking a concussion." Tralla regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "You may have a point." Their partnership grew stronger as they began to find common ground. Ethan even managed to teach Tralla a few human customs, like the importance of humor. One evening, after an exhausting day of preparation, Ethan attempted to explain human lullabies. "It's simple," he said, strumming an improvised tune on a Zincarian string instrument. "Soft, repetitive, and soothing. Like this." He started singing a nonsensical melody about stars and moons, his voice more enthusiastic than talented. Trala watched in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she remarked, "Your voice is unusual." "That's one way to put it," Ethan replied, grinning. "But it works. Trust me." Trala hesitated before responding. "Perhaps you will handle the lullabies." As Trala's pregnancy progressed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She became less dismissive of his ideas and more willing to engage in playful banter. Their once tense exchanges were now laced with mutual respect and, dare he admit it, a hint of camaraderie. One day, while reviewing a list of potential baby names, Ethan suggested, "What about something that reflects both our cultures? Like Zethan?" Trala's tail twitched. "Zethan. It is not terrible." "High praise coming from you," Ethan quipped, earning a rare smirk from Trala. The moments of levity were balanced by the ever-present weight of their responsibility. The Zincarian Council frequently reminded them that their child would represent the union of two vastly different species, a symbol of hope for the galaxy. No pressure. Ethan tried to stay focused on the positives, like the fact that he was learning to navigate Zincarian customs without embarrassing himself. Mostly. During a formal ceremony to bless the unborn child, Ethan accidentally misinterpreted a gesture of respect as an invitation to dance. The resulting spectacle left the entire room in stunned silence, until Trala, in a rare display of humor, joined in, turning the incident into a shared joke. "See?" Ethan said afterward. "Humans aren't the only ones who can adapt." Trala's gaze softened. "Perhaps you are not as fragile as I once thought." "And you're not as terrifying as I once thought," Ethan replied, though his grin betrayed the lingering fear she still inspired. As they prepared for the next phase of their journey, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. He and Trala might be an unlikely team, but together, they were proving that even the most improbable alliances could work, with enough effort, patience, and the occasional awkward dance. Ethan's morning began with a reminder that his life was far from normal now. Trala had decided to test the structural integrity of the baby's crib by throwing a weighted Zincarian training sphere at it, shattering the metal frame into pieces. "That was the third crib this week," Ethan exclaimed, running a hand through his hair. "Do you even understand the concept of gentle?" Trala crossed her arms, looking utterly unrepentant. "If it cannot withstand basic stress tests, it is unfit for our child." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Our child isn't going to be bench-pressing starships on day one. Maybe let's prioritize comfort over durability for once." Trala's tail flicked, and she let out a small grunt of what Ethan had learned was reluctant agreement. It was a minor victory, but he'd take it. The closer they got to the baby's arrival, the more chaotic their lives became. The Zincarian Council, in its infinite wisdom, had decreed that Ethan and Trala would need to present a united front by hosting a series of events showcasing interstellar parenting harmony. This, of course, led to disaster. During one such event, Ethan was tasked with demonstrating a human feeding technique using a simulation doll. He'd barely begun explaining how to hold a bottle when the Zincarian audience erupted into laughter. "Why does the human coddle the infant?" one warrior asked, pointing at Ethan's careful cradling. "It's called nurturing," Ethan replied, trying not to sound defensive. "Human babies don't pop out ready to wrestle space tigers." The warrior snorted. "Perhaps that is why your species is so fragile." Before Ethan could retort, Trala stepped in. "Enough," she said, her voice commanding. "Ethan's methods may be unconventional, but they have merit. Our child will benefit from both approaches." Ethan shot her a look of surprised gratitude. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," he muttered. Trala gave a slight nod. "You are not entirely useless." High praise, indeed. As the due date approached, Ethan found himself wrestling with a mix of anxiety and excitement. The idea of being a father, especially to a half-human, half-Zincarian child, was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm going to mess this up," he admitted one evening, sitting beside Trala in their shared quarters. "I mean, what do I know about raising a kid, let alone an intergalactic hybrid?" Trala, uncharacteristically gentle, placed a hand on his shoulder. You underestimate yourself, as do many others. But you have already proven that humans are capable of more than we believed. Ethan blinked, taken aback by her sincerity. Was that a compliment? Do not let it go to your head, she replied, but there was a faint softness in her tone. Their partnership had evolved into something resembling genuine camaraderie. They still bickered endlessly, but there was an underlying respect that hadn't been there before. This newfound bond was put to the test during a sudden emergency. A rogue Zincarian faction, opposed to the union of their species, staged an attack on the council chambers, where Trala and Ethan happened to be presenting their parenting plans. The attack was swift and brutal, but Trala leapt into action without hesitation. Ethan, to his own surprise, didn't freeze. Instead, he used the chaos to his advantage, directing panicked council members to safety while using his wits to distract the attackers. At one point, a Zincarian rebel cornered him. Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a ceremonial spear, and held it awkwardly. "Okay, buddy," he said, trying to sound confident. "Let's not make this a thing." Before the rebel could attack, Trala intervened, taking down the threat with a single, well-placed strike. "Nice timing," Ethan said, his heart pounding. "You are reckless," Trala replied, though there was a hint of approval in her gaze. "But effective." The incident cemented their status as a team. When the dust settled, the council expressed gratitude, and a newfound respect, for Ethan's quick thinking. "You have shown great bravery," the elder Zincarian said. "Perhaps humans are not as fragile as we believed." "About time someone noticed," Ethan replied, exhausted but triumphant. In the final weeks before the baby's arrival, Trala and Ethan found themselves reflecting on how much they had grown, not just as individuals, but as partners. "We've come a long way," Ethan said one evening as they worked together to assemble yet another crib. Trala glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You have surprised me, human." "That's kind of my thing," he replied with a grin. When the day finally came, it was as chaotic as everything else in their journey. Zincarian births were not the quiet, serene affairs Ethan had imagined. Instead, they were loud, intense, and involved a level of physical endurance he could only describe as superhuman. Despite the madness, Ethan stayed by Trala's side, offering what support he could. When their child was finally born, a tiny, wriggling hybrid with a shock of dark hair and a faintly glowing tail, Ethan felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. "Well," he said, his voice thick with awe. "That's one way to make history." Trala, cradling their newborn with surprising tenderness, looked at him and said, "Perhaps history needed rewriting." Ethan couldn't argue with that.